what this bill does.
And all of us can applaud the magnificent success of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in wiping out a lot of the traditional barriers to voting participation. And we know, of course, those barriers go all the way back to the end of the Reconstruction period: literacy tax, poll taxes, character tax, and closure of polling places, hardships imposed on registering people to vote, and so on. The Voting Rights Act got millions more people involved in American politics and got them the right to vote because it dismantled those racist barriers to vote. And it succeeded in a lot of ways. But is there any reason to think that if we just got rid of the Voting Rights Act and we didn't update the Voting Rights Act, that there would not be further attempts to stifle voting by African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and other racial minority groups?
Well, there clearly would be. At the time of the Shelby County decision, which, as we know, stopped the pre-clearance on the grounds that it wasn't up to date. Immediately, several states reimposed voting restrictions that the Justice Department under Section 5 had said were discriminatory. And we know that would happen again. It happened before, and we have to update Section 4 to prevent that from happening.
Well, and in fact, are we not living through a terrible onslaught against voting rights across the country today? Are there not more than 400 bills that have been introduced to try to repeal or roll back early voting, weekend voting, mail-in voting, the accessibility of absentee ballots, and so on? In Georgia, where massive political organizing and voter turnout just elected 2 Democrats to the U.S. Senate, including the first African-American ever elected senator from Georgia, they just signed into law a very restrictive anti-voting measure that included making it a crime to pass somebody a bottle of water or a chocolate chip cookie while they're waiting in line to vote. So are we not in the midst of a massive effort to try to dismantle voting in the country?
We certainly are. As you said, we've seen over 400 bills introduced in various state legislatures to do this. And you mentioned the example in Georgia. You have to fill it out. Georgia, in fact, deliberately reduced the number of polling places in minority areas, thus creating the long lines, which it then seeks to make sure you can't help someone by giving them a cup of coffee or a donut or a glass of water while they're waiting on the long lines that the state created by closing the ballot locations. So we've seen a clear pattern in many states. As you mentioned, over 400 bills have been introduced, and we have to revitalize the Voting Act, as we were invited to do by the Supreme Court.
And is this not precisely the role for Congress that's contemplated in the Reconstruction amendments, in the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment? Do we not have the power to implement the meaning of those constitutional amendments precisely because people's right to vote is fundamental, even against their own state government, because state governments don't have the power to disenfranchise their own populations? Isn't it Congress to be guaranteeing a Republican form of government to everyone and guaranteeing everybody's right to vote?
Certainly, we have that right. As I mentioned before, the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th and 15th Amendments, were designed specifically for that. And Congress always had that power under the Elections Clause, saying that Congress can define the time, places, and manner of electing Congress, but it had been so flagrantly disregarded that after the Civil War, the 14th and 15th Amendments were added to to emphasize the fact, and the Voting Rights Act is enacted pursuant to those, so we clearly have the ability, the constitutional right to do this.
And don't both sides accept that federal law is paramount to state law? In fact, I think Donald Trump brought 61 different cases in federal court and state court to overthrow state election results, attacking them as unconstitutional under the federal Constitution. Now, his claims had no factual validity and they had no legal validity, but he was trying to overthrow state election results and basically did that all the way up until January 6th, when they tried to get Congress to nullify the election results being brought in by the governors from the particular states. Isn't that right?
That is quite correct.
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, I would just say that we not only have the power, as Mr. Nadler says, and the right to vindicate the voting rights of all the people, I think we've got the obligation to do that as the Congress of the United States. I think we've got to do everything in our power to protect people's rights to vote against any kind of hostile legislation that they would face at the local, at the state, or the federal level. We have an obligation as the Congress under the Republican Guarantee Clause to guarantee to people a Republican form of government, meaning a representative form of government with everybody having the right to participate on the basis of one person, one vote, as the Supreme Court has said under the 14th Amendment cases. So I'm going to support this legislation, and we should do everything in our power to make sure and we are securing the rights of everybody to vote. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. Mr. Reschenthaler, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Ms.